Almost exactly 74 years ago today, Mr. George Orwell wrote the following very famous line. It was in his book 1984, and this is what he wrote the party wanted the population to believe. Quote, "War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength." And you know, with every single passing day, it seems like the messaging that's coming down to us, meaning the American citizens, from our very own federal government, well, it seems to resemble the world of 1984 more and more. Case in point, over on the FDA's website, they maintain a webpage called, quote, "Why you should not use ivermectin to treat or prevent COVID-19, which, funny enough, has a picture of a woman holding a horse right there at the top of the screen. But that's not the only funny thing about that particular webpage, because when you actually dig into it, you find that the clinical trials that the FDA points to, the ones that are listed on that page, when you click on them and you read them, they say the exact opposite. I repeat, the FDA says that ivermectin does not work against COVID-19, but in order to prove that point, they link to studies which say that it does. Now, that all sounds too ridiculous to be true. Let's go through it point by point. Although, just to start with, I will mention that I am by no means a doctor, and this is obviously not in any way medical advice. Instead, I will report to you what we were able to discover in our research so that you can be better informed, either when you're making your own medical decisions and or when you're over at your doctor's office speaking with your physician. Now, with that disclaimer out of the way, in case you've never heard of it before, ivermectin is an FDA-approved drug which is typically prescribed to treat several different types of intestinal parasites. And even before the COVID pandemic, ivermectin was a drug whose use was fairly widespread. It's been administered to quite literally several billion people around the world. In fact, the people who discovered ivermectin, they won the Nobel Prize in Medicine back in the year 2015. And so that's all to say that this discussion is not about some fringe drug that no one's ever heard of before. Ivermectin is established and trusted medicine. However, it is worth noting that despite its widespread use, ivermectin is not approved by the FDA to treat COVID, even though many people use it for that purpose anyway, including many doctors across the whole country who prescribe it to their patients. And so, seeing this widespread and popular drug being prescribed by doctors to treat COVID, well, the FDA decided to put out this statement, the one that's titled, "Why you should not use ivermectin to treat COVID-19. Here's part of what their statement says. Quote, "There seems to be a growing interest in a drug called ivermectin for the prevention or treatment of COVID-19 in humans. Certain animal formulations of ivermectin, such as pour-on, injectable, paste, and drench, are approved in the US to treat or prevent parasites in animals. For humans, ivermectin tablets are approved at very specific doses to treat some parasitic worms, and there are topical on-the-skin formulations for head lice and skin conditions like rosacea. The FDA has not authorized or approved ivermectin for use in preventing or treating COVID-19 in humans or animals. Currently available data do not show ivermectin is effective against COVID-19. Clinical trials assessing ivermectin tablets for the prevention or treatment of COVID-19 in people are ongoing." Then, in that very last sentence, the FDA actually placed a hyperlink, and once you click on it, you're taken to a repository of 89 different studies, all of which relate to ivermectin's effect regarding COVID. And just for your reference, that particular repository is part of a database that's maintained by the US National Library of Medicine. And as you can see, just based on some of the titles of the studies, they really do run the gamut. For instance, ivermectin effect on SARS-CoV-2 replication in patients with COVID-19, ivermectin treatment efficacy in COVID-19 high-risk patients, inhaled ivermectin in COVID-19, ivermectin and nitazoxanide combination therapy for COVID-19, ivermectin nasal spray for COVID-19 patients, and so on and so forth. In total, there are 89 such studies in that repository. Then, as you can see next to the names of the studies, there's a column for the status, meaning whether the study is in the stage of just recruiting patients, whether the study is currently active and ongoing, or whether the study is complete and the data is already available. And so, we here at the Epoch Times, we went in and we filtered that database in order to only look at the studies that have been completed and that have their results available online. And when we filtered it that way, we wound up with 32 studies completed and the data was available online. Then, after reviewing those studies, here's what we found. Half of them indicate that ivermectin effectively combats and or prevents COVID-19. Another 6 of the studies presented mixed results, meaning that ivermectin might work against COVID, but the data was not statistically significant enough. And then there were 10 studies which found no evidence that ivermectin was effective. Meaning, in practical terms, that when you examine the completed trials that were linked to by the FDA, it shows that a full 69% of them say that ivermectin is or might be effective against COVID. Now, in terms of what these studies actually look like, let's go through a few of them. There's one here that was published in the Journal of International Medical Research. In this study, researchers who were based out of Bangladesh were looking at the effects of ivermectin on 363 trial participants. And here's what they found. Quote, patients with mild to moderate COVID-19 infection treated with ivermectin plus doxycycline recovered earlier, were less likely to progress to more serious disease, and were more likely to be COVID-19 negative by RT-PCR on day 14. Then, there was another study, this one published in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases, which found that ivermectin decreased the level of COVID as well as its viability. Specifically, in that study, which was conducted by researchers based out of Israel, they were comparing 47 patients who received ivermectin against 42 patients who received a placebo. And here's what they wrote they found. Quote, ivermectin significantly reduced the time of viral shedding and affected viral viability when initiated in the first week after evidence of infection. There were lower viral loads and less viable cultures in the ivermectin group, which shows its anti-SARS-CoV-2 activity. Then there was another study, this one published in the Journal of Clinical and Biomedical Investigation. And in this study, researchers who were based out of Argentina, they found that a regimen of ivermectin as well as carrageenan worked as a prophylaxis, meaning it worked as a type of preventative medicine. In their trial, which involved 229 healthcare workers, they found that ivermectin helped to prevent COVID infection. Then there was actually a follow-up study that was conducted involving 1,200 healthcare workers, which confirmed the same results. And interestingly enough, we here at the Epoch Times, we were actually able to connect with one of these Argentinian researchers, and he wrote to us this in an email, quote, ivermectin could have saved so many lives. It's been a crime against mankind to prevent its prescription. Now again, in total, 10 of the completed studies did not support ivermectin, but 22 of them either supported it or had mixed results. Furthermore, ivermectin is a fairly safe drug. In fact, even in the FDA warning, the one they posted on their website, the main danger that they cited for ivermectin was overdosing on it, because people were taking ivermectin pills and ivermectin creams that were designed for large animals, like horses and cows. People were taking these animal-sized ivermectin doses, and some of those people were getting sick. But here's the million-dollar question. Ivermectin has been issued to several billion humans across the whole world for many, many years now. So why was it that all of a sudden, only during the pandemic, people started to take ivermectin that was formulated for animals? Well, the answer to that question is rather simple. Because of the federal government, as well as the mainstream media's demonization of ivermectin, people suddenly found themselves in a situation where they were not easily able to find it almost anywhere. Doctors were afraid to prescribe it. Doctors in some jurisdictions were not even allowed to prescribe it. Hospitals refused to administer it even if you had a prescription. And if you didn't happen to live in a state like Nebraska, which literally had their attorney general come out and clarify that they won't pursue charges for doctors prescribing ivermectin, well, then you were out of luck. And so people, naturally enough, started to turn to ivermectin pills and ivermectin creams that were formulated for animals, because at the very least they can get their hands on that stuff. And of course, because those formulations were for 2,000 or 3,000 pound animals, some people wound up overdosing. This is, if nothing else, a phenomenal example of a so-called problem that the government is trying to fix, when the problem itself was caused by the government. Because think about it. The FDA tells people to not use ivermectin because studies show that it doesn't work. When you look at the studies, they actually show that it does work, or at the very least, it probably works. And so people are naturally interested in taking the stuff. But because the FDA has demonized it so much, you can't find human-formulated ivermectin anywhere. People then turn to using animal-sized doses of ivermectin instead. Some people experience overdoses, which the FDA then turns around and cites as an example of how dangerous the drug is and why it shouldn't be used. This all reminds me of that very famous quote from Ronald Reagan. Quote, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Now again, I am not a doctor, I am not a scientist, and this is not medical advice. And to be frank with you, I don't even really know whether ivermectin works against COVID or not. However, what I do know is that when you look at the clinical trials, the ones that the FDA themselves link to, you sort them by which ones are completed, you read through them, you figure out what they actually say, and you find a chart that looks a bit like this. 16 positive results, 6 mixed results, and 10 not supportive results. And yet, instead of telling the public the truth, this is what the FDA decided to tweet out. You are not a horse. You are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it. And as always, the mainstream media in this country dutifully got in line and used the FDA's so-called recommendation to demonize anyone who so much as considered taking ivermectin. And of course, people were blocked on social media from discussing it. It's just like George Orwell said 74 years ago. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and 69% of the studies saying that ivermectin either is or might be effective is evidence that it doesn't work. Now, if you would like to actually dig through our research for today's episode for yourself, I'll throw links down into the description box below this video so you can peruse them at your own leisure. I'll actually throw there several links. I'll throw the FDA recommendation webpage so you can read that for yourself. I'll throw the repository link with all the different 89 studies. And then also, I'll throw our analysis of the 32 completed studies. And in our analysis, if you happen to be the type of person who's interested in digging deeper, you can actually click on each one of the studies and it'll take you to the actual medical journal so that you can read their conclusions for yourself and make up your own mind whether our analysis was correct. And by the way, if you find anything that differs in our analysis, meaning if you find that we were wrong in some of the cases, well, please leave that in the comments section below. Unlike the FDA, we'll take all of your considerations seriously. And then lastly, if you got something out of today's episode, or if you have anyone in your life that you think you'd like to share this information with, well, you can do so easily. Below this video is a share button. Once you click on it, there's going to be a pop-up with a bunch of different options. There's Telegram, Facebook, Twitter, Gab, email, or you can just click that copy link button, the blue button at the bottom, and you can send that link directly to your friends, your enemies, your family, your neighbors, your coworkers, your acquaintances, your high school sweetheart, or anyone else in your life who you think can benefit from this information. Again, that share button is right below this video, right there. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed. Most importantly, stay free.